The truth is, no one accidentally treats you badly for too long, unless there is a part of you that has grown used to being treated that way. Maybe you do not realize it right away, but that feeling has been with you for a very long time. It is not loud. It does not explode. It does not leave obvious wounds. It just sits there, quietly, like a room without light that you have lived in for so long that you forget what it feels like to open a window. It is the feeling of being interrupted while you are speaking, being passed over in a crowded conversation, being remembered last, or worse, being completely forgotten. No one ever says outright that you do not matter, but everything they do makes you understand it. You are often the first person to show up when someone needs help, the one who replies to messages the fastest, the one willing to delay your own work to help others just to get things done. You say it is okay more than necessary. You smile in moments when you should have been allowed to stay silent, and you learn to swallow the things you want to say. Because in the past, every time you spoke up, the atmosphere became heavy. So you choose to be agreeable, so agreeable that even you slowly stop knowing what you are actually feeling. At first, you call it kindness. Then you call it maturity. In the end, you call it your personality. But on very late nights, when all sounds fade away, you feel something that is hard to name, a sadness without a clear shape, a strange sense of emptiness, as if you have lived for others for a very long time, but forgotten who you are when no one needs you. And the most painful thing is not being treated badly. The most painful thing is that you begin to believe that maybe that is all you deserve. You look back at your relationships and see a familiar pattern. You give a lot at the beginning of the story. You listen, you understand, you compromise. At first, the other person is grateful. Then they get used to it. Then they take it for granted. Boundaries slowly fade. Requests become more and more, and when you start to feel tired, when you slow down, when you need care in return, distance appears. No one says goodbye. There is no big conflict. You are simply pushed to the side, like an object that was once very useful but is no longer noticed. Maybe you have asked yourself, why does this keep repeating? Why do I change environments, change jobs, change partners? But the feeling of being overlooked stays the same. Why are there people who do not need to try so hard, do not need to please everyone, yet they are still heard, respected, and hold a clear place in the lives of others? That question is not for comparison. It just quietly gnaws at you, little by little, each time you realize you are once again standing in that familiar position. You may have tried to change the way you behave. You tell yourself that next time you will be firmer, that you cannot let this continue. But when the moment comes, when someone crosses your boundary, you hesitate, just a very short second. But in that second, you remember the feeling of being disliked, abandoned, seen as difficult, and so you choose silence again. You choose ease again. You betray your own feelings again to hold on to a fragile sense of safety. What few people tell you is this, that silence is never neutral. Every time you stay silent in the face of what hurts you, you are teaching the world how to treat you, not with words, but with energy, with posture, with the way you shrink yourself to fit into someone else's space, and the world is very good at reading those signals, even when you are not aware that you are sending them. Carl Jung once said that the most frightening thing is not being seen through by others, but having to see through yourself. Because when you truly look inward, you may have to admit something uncomfortable, that a part of you has grown used to not being respected, not because you like it, but because it is familiar. Because from very early on, you learned that to stay safe, to be accepted, to remain, you needed to step back. Maybe no one ever said that to you directly, but you felt it through the sighs when you objected, through the irritated looks when you expressed your needs, through the coldness every time you were no longer as good as before. And so you reached a conclusion very early: it is better not to bother anyone, including yourself. This story does not begin with others being cruel. It begins with the moment you learn to turn your back on your own feelings in exchange for acceptance. And when that repeats for long enough, you no longer realize you are doing it. It becomes instinct, becomes reflex, becomes a part of who you are, until one day you are exhausted and you do not understand why. If you are listening to these lines and feel as if someone is retelling your life, then perhaps it is time for you to stop, not to blame yourself, not to find more reasons to justify others, but to ask a very simple yet very difficult question in the end. How are you treating yourself? There is an uncomfortable truth that most of us avoid, not because it is wrong, but because it is too close. The world does not treat you randomly. It does not wake up every morning deciding who it will overlook today. Most of the time, it is simply responding to how you show up in it, not through words, but through position, through boundaries, through the way you stand tall or bow your head before what makes you uncomfortable. You may think you are treated poorly because others are selfish, careless, or simply not considerate enough. That may be true, to a certain extent, but if you honestly look back, you will notice something that keeps repeating. The people who enter your life often understand very quickly how far they can go, not because they can read your mind, but because you have unintentionally shown them. Through the times you stayed silent, through the times you said it is okay when everything was not okay, through the way you stayed too long in situations that made you shrink. There is a very small moment, yet a decisive one, that few people notice. It is the first moment someone crosses your boundary. It may be a joke that makes you uncomfortable, an unreasonable request, a disrespectful behavior disguised as carelessness. If in that moment you choose silence, not because you agree, but because you fear making things tense, then a message has been sent, very clearly, very quietly. And from that point on, that boundary no longer exists. Carl Jung believed that outer reality is a mirror reflecting our inner unconscious world. What we do not dare to look at within ourselves will appear outside as people, situations, and relationships, not to punish us, but to remind us. When you do not acknowledge your own value, the world reflects that through how others treat you, not because you are unworthy, but because you are not standing in your rightful place. You may be used to asking yourself, what did I do wrong every time a relationship falls apart? But rarely do you ask, what did I ignore from the very beginning? Because the second question requires you to face the moments you betrayed yourself, the times you laughed it off to keep the peace, the times you stayed even when you knew you were not being respected, the times you convinced yourself that everyone is like that, while your body was quietly tightening. What matters here is not blame. Blame only traps you in the role of victim or offender. What is needed is awareness. Realizing that there is a direct connection between how you treat yourself and how the world treats you. Not in a rigid cause and effect way, but in resonance, the energy you carry, the certainty or hesitation in your eyes, the clarity or vagueness in your words. All of it is felt by others, even if they cannot name it. You may never say that you are unworthy, but you act as if it were true. You apologize for things that do not need apologies. You over-explain perfectly valid decisions. You fear disappointing others so much that you forget how much more painful it is to disappoint yourself. And slowly, you begin to live in a position lower than your true self, as if you are asking permission just to exist. Jung once said that what is not brought into consciousness will rule your life, and you will call it fate. You call it bad luck in relationships, a toxic environment, others not understanding you, but deeper than that, these are the quiet beliefs you carry about your own worth. Beliefs formed very early, very quietly, and very hard to see because you have lived with them for so long. You can leave a city, but not the way you see yourself. You can begin a new relationship, but carry the same old fear. And then you are surprised when the story repeats, only with different faces, not because life does not give you chances, but because you are still telling the same story about yourself, just in a new setting. There is a very fragile moment in this journey, when you begin to suspect that the problem is not only outside. That moment is both frightening and freeing. Frightening because you can no longer keep blaming. Freeing because for the first time, you realize you have the power to change something. Not others, but the way you show up before them. This does not mean you have to become cold or suspicious of everyone. It simply means you need to start listening to the small signals within yourself. The tightening in your chest when you agree to something you do not want. The nameless exhaustion after pleasant gatherings. The quiet sadness when you realize you are always the one giving more than receiving. These feelings are not weakness, they are information, and you have ignored them for far too long. The story is slowly revealing something important. Disrespect from the outside does not appear on its own. It is nourished by the times you turn your back on yourself, little by little. And until you are brave enough to face that truth, the world will keep reflecting the same message back to you, only in different forms. There is a question that has quietly followed you for many years, even though you rarely say it out loud. Why do I have to try so hard just to be treated kindly? Why am I always the one adjusting, the understanding one, the one who steps back, while others seem to do nothing and are still listened to? That question does not appear when you are busy. It only comes when you are tired, when you realize you are slowly running empty and no one notices, when you wonder if you are asking for too much, simply because you want to be respected like a normal human being. In truth, you learned to prove your worth very early. Maybe as a child, you were praised when you were well-behaved, when you knew how to give in, when you did not cause trouble. You learned that affection came from pleasing others, and so you grew up with a very deep, very quiet belief: I have to be good enough to be allowed to stay. I have to be useful to be needed. I have to be agreeable to be loved. No one ever said that to you directly, but you felt it in every small reaction from the world around you. Then, that belief followed you into adulthood. You try to become the ideal version in every relationship: the child who does not burden their parents, the partner who does not ask for too much, the friend who is always there when needed, the colleague who is willing to take on extra work. You adjust yourself to fit each person's expectations, like water poured into different containers. And in that process, you slowly forget what your true shape is when you are not trying to please anyone. The problem is not the desire to be accepted. That is very human. The problem is when acceptance becomes the only measure of your worth. When one compliment can lift you for an entire day, and one cold look is enough to make you doubt yourself. When you begin to live by other people's reactions instead of your inner sense. Carl Jung called this identifying with the social mask. You are no longer living from your essence, but from a role. There is a painful paradox. The more you try to prove you are worthy, the more you send the opposite message: that you do not believe you are enough, that your value needs confirmation from the outside, and the world, in a very unconscious way, will treat you according to that message. Not because it is cruel, but because it responds to the energy you carry. A person who does not believe in their own worth will behave as if they are replaceable, and then they are treated that way. Perhaps you have done many things for others, with a small hope you do not dare to admit, that one day they will see that you matter, that one day they will value you more. But when that does not happen, you do not get angry at them. You turn that anger toward yourself. You ask whether you have done enough. And so, you give more. A tiring loop, where sacrifice does not create respect, only familiarity and exploitation. If you're listening up to this point and feel your heart sink just a little, then perhaps this story is touching a truth you have avoided. You are not weak. You have simply grown used to living through other people's approval. And that habit, even if it once helped you survive, is now taking so much away from you. If you feel seen in these lines, you can leave a few words to share, not to prove anything, but simply to say that you are here. And if you want to go deeper into this story, stay. Because what is opening up is not blame, but a path back to your true worth. There is something you need to hear, even if it is uncomfortable. Those who live to please others will sooner or later be seen as manipulable, not because they deserve it, but because they do not set limits. When you are always available, your presence loses its weight. When you always say yes, your words lose their power. Respect is not born from how much you do, but from where you stand in your own life. The people who are truly respected are not perfect. They do not try to please everyone. They do not ask for permission to exist. They know who they are, and they are not willing to trade themselves to be loved. They can make others uncomfortable, and they accept that, not because they are cold, but because they understand that living true to yourself sometimes comes at the cost of others' displeasure. You do not need to learn how to become cold. You do not need to turn yourself into a distant version. What you need is to stop living to prove. Stop placing your worth in other people's hands. Stop waiting for the day someone realizes you are worthy. That day may never come, if you are still doubting it yourself. Perhaps, deep inside, you're tired of having to try all the time. Tired of guessing what others want so you can adjust yourself to fit. Tired of apologizing for your own emotions. If that is true, then this may be the moment you need to ask a different question. Not how do I make them respect me, but have I respected myself? That question does not have an immediate answer, but once it appears, you cannot pretend you have never heard it. It will follow you into conversations, into the moments when you are about to say yes while your body is resisting, And from that question, something begins to change, very slowly, but very real. There is a very quiet moment in your inner life when you begin to realize that the problem is not that you have not tried hard enough, but that you have been trying in the wrong direction for a very long time. You are not lacking effort. You're just using that effort to go against yourself. Every time you give in to keep the peace, every time you stay in a situation that makes you smaller, you are sending a very familiar message that other people's comfort matters more than your safety. You may not say it out loud, but your body knows. It knows through the heaviness after every meeting, through the nameless exhaustion when you get home and do not understand why you are so drained, through the irritation that gets suppressed, then turns into sadness, then into long silence. You call it a quiet personality, you call it endurance, but in truth, it is a sign that you have lived too long without clear boundaries. Carl Jung once said that humans do not live only by consciousness, but are also guided by unconscious parts that have not been acknowledged. When you are not aware of your boundaries, the world will test them for you, not to punish you, but to reveal them. The people who cross your limits are not always bad people. Often, they are simply acting on what you allowed from the beginning. And the most painful part is not that they went too far, but that you became used to letting it happen. You may remember the first time you felt disrespected, yet smiled it away. The first time you agreed to do something you did not want, just because you were afraid of being judged. The first time you told yourself that it is not worth the tension while your chest was tightening. Those first times were so small that you did not see them as a problem. But from there, a path was formed, a path of erasing yourself, step by step, very politely, very quietly. There is a big misunderstanding that many people carry that if you are good enough, patient enough, sacrificing enough, then one day others will realize it and change. But life does not work by that logic. Respect does not grow from pity or endurance. It grows from clarity, from knowing where you stand and not stepping out of that place just to be allowed to stay in someone's heart. When you do not set boundaries, you force others to guess, and people, when placed in ambiguity, will usually choose what benefits them, not because they are bad, but because it is instinct. The less clear you are, the further they go. And then, when you are hurt, you think you have been betrayed. But deeper than that, you did not protect yourself from the beginning. This is very hard to accept, because it forces you to let go of the familiar image of yourself as someone who only gives. It forces you to see that your kindness has sometimes become a way to avoid conflict, that your silence is not always noble, but often fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being disliked, fear of losing a connection, even when that connection is slowly draining you. There's a very big difference between kindness and self-erasure. Kindness comes from fullness. You give because you want to, not because you are afraid. Self-erasure comes from lack. You give to be kept, to be seen, to not be abandoned. And the world, very subtly, senses that difference. It responds to fullness with respect. It responds to lack with exploitation. You may have admired people who seem very grounded. They do not speak much, but when they do, others listen. They do not please everyone, but they have a clear place. They do not need to prove they matter, yet their presence has weight. You think they were born that way, but it is very possible they are simply people who learned early how not to betray themselves. That groundedness does not come from controlling others, but from taking responsibility for your place in your own life, from daring to let others be displeased, instead of letting yourself be hurt. From accepting that not everyone will stay, and that this is not a failure. Sometimes, it is the price of being honest with yourself. At this stage of the story, you may begin to feel a slight tension between the desire to change and the fear of losing what is familiar. That is completely normal. Because when you stand at the threshold of living more truthfully, the old part of you will speak up. It will remind you that silence feels safer, that giving in feels easier, that speaking up could make everything fall apart. But it is also here that a new question begins to form. No longer why do they treat me this way, but what am I allowing to continue? That question is not meant to shame you. It is meant to return choice to you. Because once you realize you have a choice, you are no longer completely powerless. You do not need to change everything immediately. You do not need to become a different person overnight. The only thing that needs to begin changing is honesty with your own feelings. Noticing when you are uncomfortable, when you are reluctant, when you are saying yes while everything inside is saying no. These are the first signals, very small, but very real. The story has not yet reached its most difficult point, because behind the lack of boundaries, behind the habit of pleasing, there is something deeper waiting to be seen, a part of you that you learned to deny a very long time ago. And that part will decide whether you truly step out of the old loop or only change the surface. There is a very specific moment in this journey when you begin to realize that understanding the problem alone is not enough. You can read a lot, think very deeply, even resonate with every line, yet your life has not really changed, because real change does not happen in the mind. It happens in the moment you have to act differently, right where things are oldest, most familiar. And that moment often arrives in the form of a very short, very simple word, but one that makes your hands tremble just thinking about it: no. You are not afraid of the word no because it is hard to say. You are afraid because it carries too many consequences. You fear disappointed looks. You fear the atmosphere dropping. You fear being misunderstood as selfish, as cold, as changing in a bad way. And deeper than all of that, you fear that if you are no longer as easygoing as before, others will no longer need you. That fear is not unreasonable. It was formed from very real, very early experiences, when you learned that your presence was tied to whether or not you pleased someone. So you learned to say yes even when something inside you was shrinking. You learned to smile when you wanted to be silent. You learned to stay when every cell in your body was telling you it was time to leave. And each time you did that, you lost a little more of your inner power. Not because you are weak, but because you became used to living as the one who adapts, the one who endures, the one who keeps the peace at any cost. Saying no is not an act against others. It is an act of standing with yourself. But because you have stood on the other side for so long, when you turn back, the first feeling is not relief, but guilt. Guilt arrives very fast, very sharp. It whispers that you are doing something wrong, that you are breaking an image that once helped you be accepted. And if you do not understand this mechanism, you will easily return to the old way, just to end that discomfort. Carl Jung called this process a necessary confrontation on the path to becoming yourself. A confrontation not with others, but with the old version of you. The version that learned to survive by pleasing. The version that believed safety only came when no one was uncomfortable because of you. That version once helped you survive, and because of that, it does not want to leave. It will pull you back every time you're about to step across a new boundary. You will see this very clearly when you begin to say no to people who are used to exploiting your ease. They will be the first to react, not because you're wrong, but because your boundary exposes an imbalance they never had to face before. Some will be angry, some will be hurt, some will say that you have changed, and in that moment, it will be very easy to doubt yourself. But pause here for a moment. Every change will disrupt the old order. When you no longer play the role of the always available one, the system around you is forced to adjust. Some relationships will not survive that adjustment because they were built on you always giving. When that foundation disappears, the truth is revealed. And even though that truth hurts, it is also very clear. Each time you say no to something that drains you, you are saying yes to your life. Each time you refuse a relationship that only takes, you are choosing to protect your inner space. And each time you allow someone to be dissatisfied instead of allowing yourself to be hurt, you are slowly reclaiming lost power. Power not to control others, but to no longer be controlled by the fear of abandonment. What is important to understand is this saying, no does not need to be loud. It does not need long explanations. It does not need to be justified with a list of reasons. True steadiness lives in brevity and clarity. I cannot do that. That does not work for me. I'm not comfortable with this. These sentences do not need others to agree in order to be valid. They only need you to believe them. You may be surprised to realize that the world does not collapse when you begin to set boundaries. Some people will leave, yes, but others will begin to respect you more. Not because you became hard, but because you became clear. Clarity is the foundation of respect. When you know where you stand, others also know where they can stand with you. At this stage, you may feel like you are standing between two worlds. One side is the familiarity of pleasing, safe but suffocating. The other side is honesty with yourself, spacious but unfamiliar. This transition is not smooth. It may make you feel lonelier for a while, but that is not a sign you are going the wrong way. It is a sign you are leaving structures that no longer fit. You do not need to say no to everything at once. You only need to start with the smallest places, with promises that exhaust you, with meetings you attend out of obligation, with conversations you stay in even when you are no longer respected. Each small boundary you set is a brick rebuilding the foundation of your self-worth. And slowly, you will notice a very subtle change. You are no longer as tense as before. You no longer need to perform. You begin to feel your own presence in your own life, not as someone serving other people's emotions, but as a human being with needs, with limits, with the right to be protected. But this journey does not end here, because even when you learn how to say no, there is still a very strong pull that can bring you back to the old path, a pull that does not come from the outside, but from within. It hides deep in the parts you have not dared to look at, in the emotions you were once taught were not allowed to exist, and to be truly free, you will need to go there. There is a deeper reason why saying no, even when it is right, still makes you tremble. Not because you are weak, but because every time you stand up to protect yourself, you touch a very old part of your soul, a part that was once taught that firmness is dangerous, that anger is bad, that resistance means losing love. That part does not disappear when you grow up. It simply retreats into the shadows and continues to control you from behind. Carl Jung called that place the shadow, not something evil, but everything you once had to bury in order to be accepted. Righteous anger, the desire to protect yourself, the need to say enough. As a child, perhaps every time you protested, you were scolded for being bad. Every time you were angry, you were ignored. Every time you asked for more, you were seen as selfish. And so you learned to stay silent to survive. You learned to become agreeable so you would not be abandoned. You grew up with a gentle, well-behaved exterior, always yielding. But alongside that, you also lost the right to be angry when you were hurt. You did not allow yourself to be uncomfortable. You did not allow yourself to react. You called that suppression maturity. But in truth, it was only an outdated survival strategy, still running quietly like an old program in your mind. What is buried does not die. It accumulates, and then it shows up in other forms. Suppressed anger becomes anxiety. Rejected firmness becomes fear. A forgotten voice becomes numbness. You do not explode, but you are exhausted. You do not argue, but you feel a deep sadness. You do not leave, but you feel yourself slowly disappearing. Think back to the moments when you endured something that was clearly not okay. A comment that humiliated you in front of others, a request that crossed a line, a relationship that made you constantly cautious. You knew it was not okay, yet you stayed. You convinced yourself that it is not worth it, that just let it go, that I should understand them. But afterward, you went home feeling dirty, small, and used. That is not peace. That is the shadow controlling you. Jung once said that what you do not accept in yourself will control you. When you do not accept healthy anger, it turns you into someone who is constantly violated. When you do not accept necessary firmness, it turns you into someone who is always afraid to speak. When you do not accept your right to protect yourself, you will keep waiting for someone else to do it for you, and often, no one does. You tolerate what is intolerable not because you do not feel pain, but because you are afraid to touch the part of yourself you learned to hate, the part that wants to resist, the part that wants to stand upright, the part that no longer wants to be a good person, but wants to be a real person. You still believe that to be loved, you must be gentle. To keep relationships, you must fade. But that is an old lie, repeated so many times that you mistook it for truth. As long as you keep running from your shadow, you will keep meeting it in your life, in the form of controlling people, relationships that drain you, situations that force you to swallow your anger. You change environments, but the feeling stays the same. You change people, but the wound remains unchanged, not because you are unlucky, but because the lesson has not yet been faced. The way out does not lie in becoming aggressive or cold. It lies in becoming whole, meaning you allow yourself both softness and firmness, both compassion and boundaries, both love and the ability to say enough. Integrating the shadow does not make you a bad person. It makes you someone who is no longer easily hurt in the old way. When you begin to accept healthy anger, you no longer fear conflict as before. When you allow yourself to be firm at the right moments, you no longer need to raise your voice to be heard. When you acknowledge the need to be protected, you no longer look for salvation from the outside. A very quiet change happens. You no longer need to prove anything. You begin to stand more firmly within yourself. This is a step that requires courage, because it forces you to let go of the familiar image of yourself as someone who is always agreeable. It forces you to accept that some people will not like this new version of you. But if you look closely, those are often the ones who benefited the most from your silence. And losing such relationships is not a loss, it is a release. You are moving very close to an important threshold, a place where you no longer only react out of old habits, but begin to choose consciously, a place where you no longer live to avoid pain, but live in truth. And when you step across that threshold, your story will no longer be written by the fear of abandonment, but by the respect you have for yourself. There is a very quiet morning, when you wake up and realize you are no longer carrying that familiar heavy feeling. Not because life has suddenly become easier, but because something inside you has shifted. You no longer scan the outside world to guess who you need to be today in order to be accepted. You are simply present, and that presence, for the first time in a very long while, does not need permission. You begin to notice that you no longer react immediately to other people's looks, words, or judgments. A small pause appears. In that pause, you manage to ask yourself a very different question. Does this fit me? Not what they think, also, not what they expect, but whether you are betraying yourself again or not. That pause changes everything. It gives back to you the power of choice you once thought you did not have. You no longer try to explain too much. You no longer apologize for your feelings. You no longer feel that you must prove you deserve to be treated with kindness. Your no now no longer trembles the way it used to. It is not sharp, not cold, just clear. And that clarity makes the world adjust the way it approaches you, not because you force anyone, but because you no longer leave the door open to what hurts you. Some people slowly drift away, without noise, without drama. They simply no longer find in you the version that was always ready to sacrifice. At first, this may ache a little, but then you realize a very gentle truth: relationships that only existed when you made yourself smaller never truly saw you. Their leaving is not a loss, but the space you need to breathe. In that space, you begin to feel yourself more clearly. You know when you're tired. You know when you need silence. You know when you want to be alone without having to explain. Being alone no longer smells like loneliness. It feels like coming home after a long journey, where you do not have to play any role at all. You just get to be yourself, with all the parts that were once denied, now allowed to exist together. You are no longer as afraid of being judged, because you have stopped judging yourself by other people's measures. When someone is unhappy, you do not rush to fix yourself. You listen, but you do not lose yourself. When someone does not understand, you no longer exhaust yourself trying to explain. You understand that not everyone needs to understand you for you to live truthfully. This peace is not loud, but it is solid. You begin to notice yourself standing straighter, both literally and inwardly. Your eyes no longer avoid. Your voice no longer fades at the end of sentences, not because you want to appear strong, but because you are no longer as afraid as before. Respect from the outside begins to appear, not as a reward, but as a natural response. When you respect yourself, the world has no choice but to adjust. Most importantly, you no longer live to be chosen. You live from your own choices. You choose where you belong. You choose relationships that do not require you to disappear in order to stay. You choose conversations where your voice has a place, and when those things are not there, you choose to leave, without resentment, without bitterness, simply with honesty. At times, you may still feel afraid. At times, old habits may still whisper that silence would be easier, but you now know how painful it feels to betray yourself, and you no longer want to return there. You know that the peace you have now does not come from pleasing, but from living in alignment. And you understand that living in alignment sometimes means not being liked by everyone. But you also understand one very clear thing: being liked by everyone never made you happy. It only made you tired. And now, even if you are not perfect, even if you are not always certain, You are living a present life, a life where you do not need permission to exist, a life where you no longer wait for someone to give you value. This rebirth is not as loud as you once imagined. It does not arrive in an explosive moment. It comes very quietly, very deeply, in the way you speak to yourself, in the way you walk away from places that no longer fit, in the way you stop seeking validation from distant eyes, and in the calm that slowly spreads, when you realize you no longer have to strain to be someone else. You do not need to become untouchable. You only need to become honest, not cold, just clear, not proving, just present. When you stand firmly within yourself, the world will either meet you there or it will walk away. Both are fine, because in the end, you have stopped abandoning yourself. And that is freedom. Not freedom from others, but freedom from the judgment that held you captive for so long. Freedom to live a life that does not ask for permission. Freedom to respect yourself, even when no one is watching. Because from this moment on, you know one thing very clearly: when you respect yourself, you no longer need to ask the world for anything else.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.